Hello there. Today I thought I would talk to you about something a bit different. It's still related to books in a roundabout way, but I thought I would talk to you about some of the films that I love that are about writers. These are films that are specifically about their writing in their life. I did have a few films that were sort of based on memoirs, like Eat, Pray, Love and Wild and things like that, but I didn't want to include them because they're not specifically about writing or that person's writing life. So that's what this is going to be about. I thought it would just be nice to talk about something a bit different, and I know as a reader and a writer I love finding films about writers. I think they're fascinating. So let's get straight into it. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the one that I don't have here before I forget it, and that is To Walk Invisible. This was a BBC film, and I don't know if this was the first time it was shown, but I discovered it last Christmas. And yes, this is about the Bronte sisters, and it kind of looks at their life and their struggles with writing, and it was so fascinating and lovely to watch. I think it's got the typical BBC film thing of it possibly being quite slow and not necessarily for you if you're not interested in the Bronte sisters, but it was really wonderful, and it was so sad actually. I didn't know anything really about their lives outside of their writing until that point, so it was also really sad to hear their story and sort of follow them for the duration of the film while they're getting published and while they're sort of coming together and starting to get published. And then it goes on at the end to tell us what happens after that time period, and obviously it's quite upsetting, so I would recommend that one. Then I've also got one which I'm going to talk about first because it's kind of the odd one out of this lot, and that is Midnight in Paris. This is different because it's not specifically about one writer, but I think it was worth mentioning anyway. It's not a standout film, it's not amazing, but it's still enjoyable and it's still quite interesting. This is about good old Owen Wilson. I've only watched it once, but from what I can remember, he goes to Paris with his girlfriend and they end up kind of not getting along, so he ends up going for kind of midnight strolls in Paris on his own, and he kind of manages to stumble back in time to the artist sort of bohemian hub of Paris, where he meets people like Ernest Hemingway, he meets F. Scott Fitzgerald, he meets all of those writers that were around in that time period. And I don't know how factual it is, but it was quite enjoyable, and I would say it's worth a mention here because it does involve quite a lot of writers and it kind of looks at that lifestyle, which was interesting. Then all of the others are sort of directly about writers in some way or another. So I'm going to start with On the Road because again it's kind of a little bit different. This is a movie adaptation of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, which is obviously pretty much a memoir with quite a fair bit of embellishment along the way, but this still looks at Jack Kerouac's life and it looks at Allen Ginsberg. You meet William Burroughs, you meet all the people that he knew during his lifetime, and obviously it's predominantly about Neil Cassidy, or as he's known in this, Dean Moriarty. I'd say this probably isn't one for you if you haven't read the book. It's very slow, nothing much happens, as you can probably expect from a book adaptation of On the Road, because On the Road is a book in which not much happens. But I think what's good about On the Road, and I reread it a few years ago and I have to say it didn't blow me away half as much as it did when I was about 16, but I love the pacing of On the Road. So it starts off really slow, and then as you read it, it gets faster and faster, and the language gets faster, and it's like a beat kind of, it draws you in and it pulls you along. And the film doesn't quite have that, but it does have some charm, and as I say, if you enjoy the book I think you can definitely enjoy this. I have tried to show it to people who haven't read the book, and seeing it through their eyes I can see why it would look absolutely dull, but yeah, I would recommend it. And then the others are pretty much direct films about the writers, and I'm not sure how factual most of these are, to be honest. I think a lot of the time they get very embellished. So there is Miss Potter, which is about Beatrix Potter. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this one and seen it even. It's probably off the list one of the most well-known ones. Obviously Renee Zellweger as Beatrice Potter, and we also have Ewan McGregor as her publisher. Again, I don't know how factual it is. A lot of these films seem to put romance at the centre, which I can understand for a Hollywood kind of big picture, but it's not always necessarily factual or how those people's lives were. And I think especially with female writers from history, it kind of diminishes what they did, because, you know, Beatrix Potter was a really strong independent woman, much like the story of Jane Austen really. She didn't want to become beholden to a rich man, so even though her family told her it would disgrace them and that she shouldn't do it, she set about making her own living and ended up doing very, very well for herself. So yeah, it's interesting, it's good, it's quite sweet and fun, and you get sort of the illustrations in the film that sort of come to life, and some of the real quirks of Beatrix Potter are in this, and I actually think Renée Zellweger does her really very well. So there's that one. Then I've got, talking of Jane Austen, Becoming Jane again. This is one of those that I don't think it's overly factual. Again, I think it kind of makes the one sort of romance that we know from Jane Austen and kind of makes it a very central part of her life, when I don't necessarily think it was. But that said, it's still quite enjoyable. It's again, it's a slow one. I think this was a BBC film as well, so it's got that slow sort of gentle pacing to it, but it's enjoyable enough. I have to say, I enjoyed it the first time I watched it a lot more than I have on rewatches, but it's still worth your time if you haven't seen it already. Then I have A Bright Star. This was the film in which I discovered my wonderful Ben Whishaw, who frankly just makes life. This is a film sort of adaptation of the life of John Keats. Predominantly it looks at his romance with Fanny Brawne, see the story from her point of view, which kind of makes sense, I think, because I believe the main letters they have come from her to him. I don't know if there are many letters from him to her in existence, so we see everything through her point of view, but we see their struggle to come together as a couple. Her family wants her to marry into a wealthy family, and obviously John Keats has no money, so even though the family really like him and they actually let him into their home, they struggle to accept that the two want to be together. Obviously John Keats died very young. That's not spoiling anything. If you know anything about John Keats, you will know that. So this is a bit of a tragedy as well, and it's really quite upsetting. Again, I would say that this puts romance very much at the centre of it rather than the writing, but I think with someone like John Keats that kind of works, and I think his romance with Fanny Brawne did very much shape the years during which he was doing most of his writing and getting ill and things. To be fair, if he had lived on, I'm sure that it wouldn't have been such a prominent part, but obviously at the time of his death, his relationship with Fanny was very much a focus for his life and his work, so it kind of works with this one. Again, it's slow, it's gentle, but I think if you just want a real Sunday afternoon film that just kind of gets your creative juices flowing, then this one is for you. Then I've got another one that you've probably heard of and possibly seen, and that is Finding Neverland. This is about J.M. Barrie. Again, it's not overly factual, but let's not dwell on that. So J.M. Barrie is played by Johnny Depp in this, who actually I think plays him very well. This looks at his relationship with the Llewellyn Davies boys, and it kind of looks at some of the controversy that surrounded that relationship, but it doesn't really go into that, and it looks at his writing Peter Pan. As I say, it's not the most factual. I think if you actually went into it, it was probably nothing like this. I think for somebody who doesn't necessarily know the history that well, it's quite a nice place to go to. It's interesting, having watched this and then read Peter and Alice, which is a play that follows later on Peter Llewellyn Davies, and to kind of know the history of what happened to the Llewellyn Davies boys in light of their relationship with J.M. Barrie. Obviously this is a kids film, so it's quite light and it kind of paints it in a really nice picture, which is nice enough to watch, but as I say, not necessarily the truth. And then we have my favourite probably of all of these, and that is Sylvia. This is about Sylvia Plath, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, and I have to say I'm not the massivest fan of Gwyneth Paltrow. I'm not bothered by her, but in this she is phenomenal. Ted Hughes is played by Daniel Craig, who again I'm not bothered, he doesn't appeal to me, but in this he is amazing. I think it's such a good film, and the interesting thing with this is that every time you watch it, and I've watched it a lot, trust me, every time you watch it you kind of see a different side of what the filmmakers are trying to say. So this is probably, in terms of factual stuff, this is probably the most on point, because I think the filmmakers have really tried to remain biased in a situation that is anything but biased. Obviously there was a lot of controversy about who was to blame for the marriage breakup between Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, and what was the cause for her eventual suicide. Obviously Ted Hughes took a great deal of the blame, and I think this film is interesting because it doesn't paint Ted Hughes as the villain particularly. It shows that both of them had flaws, and Sylvia was not necessarily in the right mind a lot of the time, and it looks at how Ted Hughes tried to deal with that, but it also looks at the fact that though Sylvia might have pushed him into certain actions at times, he did those things. So it remains really in the centre centre of the argument, and every time I watch it I'm kind of on the side of somebody else. Again, it's one of those that knowing what happened afterwards and knowing what else happened to Ted Hughes, because he had quite a terrible life. His second wife, who he left Sylvia Plath for, actually killed herself and their baby. If you ever get the chance to watch a documentary on Ted Hughes, I would recommend it. There was one on BBC a few years ago that was really interesting. Anyway, so also obviously Ted Hughes stopped a lot of Sylvia Plath's writing from being published, but not only that, he burnt a lot of it. Knowing that, you know, it kind of changes your opinion. I think I'll always be on Sylvia's side, because I think no matter what she did, no writer deserves that treatment. But it's really interesting, it's really good. It looks at her journey from leaving university right up to her death. So it looks at the birth of her children, it looks at their relationship, their moving around and trying to sort of deal with each other, and obviously their eventual falling apart, and Sylvia Plath going on to write Ariel. It just is so good. As I say, I couldn't imagine an actress that would have done this better than Gwyneth Paltrow does, which is so interesting because when you think of Sylvia Plath, Gwyneth Paltrow is not the person who comes to mind. But anyway, if you haven't seen it, please do. It's so good. So those are some of my favourite writer-based films. There are others that, as I say, I haven't mentioned for one reason or another. These I thought kind of fit that brief best. Please let me know down below if you know of any other adaptations like this that I would enjoy, and I will see you next time. Bye!